This is my 2018 Yamaha MT09, which makes it a second generation. And despite Yamaha now being all the way onto the fourth generation of MT09s, I still think that this is a very desirable bike. And I suspect that a lot of people are still going to be buying them on the used market for years to come. So today I wanted to share some of my experiences and opinions about this bike before I let it go. You see, I'm about to sell this bike after 2 years of ownership. So I figured I couldn't physically get a longer term review than that. Plus, this is actually my third MT09 that I've owned. I had 2 first gens and now this second gen. So I think that I have somewhat of a different appreciation for this specific generation. A review obviously has to delve into the negative aspects as well, but I don't want that to be your main takeaway from this video. This is undoubtedly a brilliant bike that is so much fun to ride. The amount of times I get home from riding this, pat it and tell it what a good bike it is way too often. Let's start with the fun stuff. When you finish up a good ride on this bike and you start to walk away from it, you can't help but look back at it because this is the best looking generation of MT09 in everyone's opinion. The second generation got this updated headlight that some say looks like a transformer. They also moved the indicators down here. Previously they were attached to the headlight, now they're down here on this new shroud, which looks much neater in my opinion, even though a lot of people mock Yamaha's big bulbous indicators. They also updated this tail light that's a lot sharper and a lot narrower. Everybody loves this CP3 engine, and I'm no different. The engine from the third generation onwards might be bigger, but that's largely just to compensate for Euro 5 emissions. If you want to make it even more fun, you get an aftermarket exhaust like this. Now this isn't a bike that's intended for touring, so it doesn't matter if it's too drony on the highway, because through town when you're having a bit of fun, this makes it even more fun. You can hear all the brilliant noises coming out of this motor. And if you have an aftermarket exhaust like that on a bike like this, it makes you appreciate the quick shifter even more. If you roll on just a little bit while you upshift, it makes some brilliant noises. The quick shifter definitely makes this bike a lot more fun to ride, which is an advantage over the first gen that didn't have one. It does, however, only work on the way up through the gears and not on the way down, which means you still have to master the art of rev matching while downshifting, which is exactly why I like this. In my opinion, it's the perfect mix of undiluted fun and a few modern amenities. It can be a little jerky when you're going at slower speeds and you have constant throttle, but as long as you're accelerating while upshifting, it's perfectly smooth. The riding position is what I would consider to be balanced. A riding position is always kind of determined on what you're used to. If you're used to something like a GS, it probably feels quite sporty. But if you're used to a superbike, then it feels very upright. So the pegs are low compared to a superbike, and the bars are obviously very high. But it's still definitely a position that encourages naughty riding, which I like. The radiator looks pretty ugly and very traditional. It definitely helps that the second gen got these shrouds to cover it a bit, but it's still very rectangular and just not pretty. A superbike is traditionally more curved, which I think looks more expensive and nicer. But thanks to it looking this traditional and big, it means you can mob around town pretty much all day and it never overheats. I live in a very hot country and it never gives me any issues, which is pretty important. If you ride something like an R1, you're constantly worrying about it overheating. And if you do a lot of miles, you'll be happy to know that thanks to the lack of fairings, it takes a few seconds to find your oil drain bolt and your oil filter, so servicing really doesn't take long at all or make much of a mess. Now let's talk about all the average points of this bike. I would lump the suspension and the brakes into this category. They're definitely better than the first generation and what you would expect at this price point, but they leave something to be desired. When Yamaha came out with the first generation of MT09, I think they tried to make it as affordable for them as possible so that if this concept of motorcycle failed, they wouldn't lose much money. But now they've proven that this concept is very well loved and sells pretty well, so every new generation we get, they make slightly better. As a result, this suspension is perfect for 95% of the time. It's perfect for everyday riding and for the everyday rider. If you desire more than this, then buy the SP model that has Öhlins as standard. The brakes are in the same boat. They're perfect for 95% of riding, but every now and then when you really try to ride it hard, you will start to notice the cheaper rubber lines and the axial master cylinder, they do begin to hold you back a bit. I've complained in the past about the ABS system on this bike. For the front brakes, it's perfect. It behaves exactly how I would expect it to. But on the back brakes, it seems to activate a bit too easily. And when it does activate, it shudders through the pedal and kicks your foot, and it's a horrible sensation. I would like it if you could turn the ABS off. Even just something like a supermoto mode like the 390 Duke has, where you could just deactivate the rear ABS, would still be safe, but also fun. And finally, let's talk about the few things that can get in the way of the fun, starting with this fuel tank. It is a brilliant shape and looks very beautiful, but as a result, it's pretty small. So you spend a lot of time at the fuel station filling it up. Of course, that is a difficult point to argue, because obviously if the tank was bigger and took more fuel, it would also make it heavier, so that would make it less fun to ride. To its credit, it has a fuel gauge, which is sometimes rare, but that tends to lie to you as well. It shows that it's full for a very long time, and then as soon as the first bar disappears, they all tend to disappear very quickly. It goes without saying that this is not a great bike for long trips on the highway. You know what you're getting when you choose a naked bike. It's more of a backstreet brawler. With that being said, you can get away with very short spurts above 200 km an hour on the highway pretty comfortably. I mean, on the Autobahn. And you could also do not too long stints, say 20 minutes to an hour, averaging about 150 km an hour. But anything longer than that, your neck definitely starts to get tired and you would like a windscreen. Of course, you could buy a little fly screen, a lot of people do, but personally, I don't like the way those look. If there are two things that get in the way of the fun the most, it has to be ABS and traction control. Technically, this bike has 3 levels of traction control: 1, 2, and off. I usually ride with it in level 1, but not because I want to, because if you turn it off, first of all, you have to hold the switch for what feels like a fortnight to get it to turn off. You also have to be stationary, and then as soon as you switch the bike off and turn it back on again, it defaults back to turned on. Level 2 definitely interferes more than level 1. You can ride around pretty happily without level 1 getting in your way. I do ride less like a lunatic on this bike than I did my Gen 1 because of traction control, where on the Gen 1 that doesn't have traction control, I found myself trying to lift the front wheel just for fun way more frequently. Where now traction control cuts the power, so what's the point of trying? When it comes to riding modes, I had to just check what riding modes it actually has, because I've always just left it in A mode. Turns out it has A, B, and standard, which are exactly how they sound. A is the most aggressive, B is the least aggressive, and standard is somewhere in the middle. Personally, I always leave it in A mode because I want everything the bike has to offer. I also like that it seems to remember what mode I left it in, unlike the traction control. So at least if you did want something more mellow or something for the rain, there is a noticeable difference between riding modes. Technically, the MT09 is capable of going 2 up. I mean, it has passenger foot pegs and a seat back here, but it's not very comfortable. I don't even know how my girlfriend gets up here because it took me about 10 minutes. The biggest issue is this bench seat, meaning it's just one long seat instead of 2 separate ones. So you're at a very similar height to your passenger, and as a result, you're often bumping helmets while riding, which isn't very comfortable. And every time you brake just a little bit too hard, your passenger slides down the seat into you. I do really like the asymmetric display on here. Yes, it's LCD and not TFT, but hey, if it saves money and makes the bike cheaper to buy, I'm all for it. The only gripe I do have about it is that you can only have one piece of information on the screen at a time. So you can push this button, there it is, to cycle through all the different pieces of information it can give you, but it won't show you, say, your coolant temperature and your trip distance at the same time, which can get really annoying. The tachometer is also really small. It's sometimes hard to see. So I've never hit the limiter on a bike more often than this, simply because it's hard to see. So as a result, I tend to short shift more than I probably should. For the last 2 years, I've had bar end mirrors on this bike, and now I've put these stock ones back on to sell it, and I've realized that I'm not a huge fan of them. The thing I see most in them is my own arms. I do tend to ride with my elbows up a lot thanks to motocross, which doesn't help, but I still think you can see a lot more behind you with bar end mirrors than these things. And for the last point, I have something a little bit petty. This bike is a nightmare to wash because it doesn't have any fairings, so that means you have infinite crevices all over the bike. So it's not a big deal, but you will cut your fingers on sharp areas more often than you'd like. But anyway, I think for the price, you can't find a more undiluted naked bike experience that looks this good. But I could be biased.